Inspector Crane consulted his notebook with the air of a man who had only recently learned to read, his thick fingers fumbling through pages as though seeking passage through a foreign landscape. The housemaid, Rosie, discovered him at 8 o'clock this morning when she came to draw the curtains, last seen alive yesterday evening around 6:30 when the butler took him his whiskey. That would be at approximately 6:30 according to Finch, the butler. Whimsy accepted this information with the gravity it deserved, which is to say with none whatsoever. He had moved toward the window in question, that supposedly inviolate barrier against the March dreariness beyond, and was examining its frame with the concentration of an entomologist studying an particularly interesting beetle. And Mr. Finch, describe him for me, if you would be so kind. I assume he has been in service at Ashworth Manor for some considerable time. 30 years, Dr. Hatfield supplied, apparently having recovered his capacity for speech. Absolutely devoted to the old man. There's no possibility that Finch had anything to do with this. He was in the servants' quarters all evening. Cook and the other maids will vouch for him. How wonderfully reassuring, Whimsy observed, though I note that devotion and impossibility are rather different concepts, and that servants' quarters, being populated by servants, tend to exhibit a remarkable solidarity when questioned by those they perceive as social superiors. But let us set that aside for the moment. I should like to speak with this household, beginning with the nephew whom Inspector Crane mentioned with such confidence. Where is the young man in question? It transpired that the nephew in question, one Mr. James Ashworth, aged 32, was currently confined to the drawing-room, under what could charitably be described as loose supervision. He was a thin, nervous creature, with the appearance of a man who had expected life to provide him with certain compensations that had singularly failed to materialize. His fingers bore the yellow staining of a chronic smoker, and his collar, though clean, bore evidence of being adjusted repeatedly throughout the morning, a habit that suggested either intense anxiety or the recent discovery that one's financial prospects had undergone a dramatic recalibration. Mr. James Ashworth, Whimsy said, entering the drawing-room with the casual manner of one dropping into a club before luncheon. I am Lord Peter Whimsy. I understand you stand to inherit a considerable portion of your uncle's estate. James's face underwent a transformation remarkable in its speed and transparency. The nervous energy that had animated him appeared to drain away, leaving behind a kind of defensive wariness. My uncle and I were not close, he said carefully. I saw him perhaps twice yearly. I had no knowledge of his will, nor did I expect to benefit from it in any material fashion. How admirably diplomatic, Whimsy replied, settling himself into a chair with the ease of one accustomed to inserting himself into domestic crises. Yet, Inspector Crane seemed to believe that you were constantly upon the premises, always broke and perpetually lurking about. One of you has developed a rather creative fiction, and I wonder which. Tell me, when was the last occasion upon which you visited Ashworth Manor? James's fingers twisted together with such intensity that Whimsy half expected them to achieve spontaneous combustion. Saturday last. I came to ask Uncle Cedric for a loan. He refused, as he always did. He said I was a wastrel and a disappointment to the family name. I left in anger and did not return until this morning, when I heard the news. And where precisely did you spend the evening of? Yesterday. The day on which your uncle was found this morning. At my flat in town. I have witnesses. My landlady, Mrs. Coleman. She can verify that I was there. Whimsy nodded, as though this information confirmed some private theory. Yet you arrived at Ashworth Manor at what hour this morning? And how did you learn of your uncle's death? The local police had not yet made any public announcement, I assume. James's expression shifted, becoming more guarded still. I had an intuition. I cannot explain it rationally. I felt something was wrong, and I drove out here. I arrived at approximately 7:45, and finding the house in its usual state of quiet, I walked around to the library window. I saw him through the glass. This detail, Whimsy reflected, was either remarkably convenient or possessed of a kind of psychological inevitability that suggested a man acting according to impulses he could not himself articulate. How extraordinary, Whimsy murmured. An intuition, you say? How very modern. My grandmother used to rely upon intuition as well, though she called it reading the cards, and it invariably led her to make decisions of catastrophic unwisdom. But let us examine your timeline with greater precision. You claim to have been in town yesterday evening. Your flat is located where, precisely? Kensington, about 18 miles from here. And you drove out this morning. At what hour did you depart? Perhaps 7 o'clock. It took me roughly 40 minutes to drive here, so I arrived around 7:45, as I said. Whimsy rose to his feet, his expression having taken on that peculiar intensity that suggested his mind had shifted into a higher register of attention. "Curious," he said softly, "decidedly curious. For I should very much like to know, Mr. James Ashworth, how you managed to develop an intuition so precise that it brought you to your uncle's estate at the precise moment when his body had been undiscovered for less than an hour. Either you possess psychic faculties of remarkable accuracy, or your account of yesterday evening contains certain omissions of potentially incriminating nature. I do hope you will not mind if I verify these details with your landlady. Inspector Crane, I believe we shall require a more thorough examination of this household's domestic arrangements, and in particular, a comprehensive statement regarding the movements of all persons resident within these walls during the hours of 6 o'clock yesterday evening until 8 o'clock this morning. The servants' hall of Ashworth Manor possessed that particular quality of orchestrated domesticity that invariably masks a multitude of territorial disputes, romantic entanglements, and simmering resentments. Whimsy found himself seated at the long oak table, with a cup of tea that had been prepared with sufficient ceremony to suggest that its consumption constituted a form of diplomatic negotiation. Across from him sat Finch, the butler, a man whose decades of service had calcified into an expression of such profound neutrality that one might easily mistake him for a particularly well-dressed monument. Beside him perched Rosie, the housemaid, a thin creature of perhaps 20 years whose nervous energy suggested she had not yet learned the art of dissembling that her colleagues had perfected over generations of service. "Now then," Whimsy began, addressing himself to the cup of tea with apparent fascination, "I wonder if you might clarify the precise sequence of events on yesterday evening. Mr. Finch, you state that you delivered whiskey to your employer at approximately 6:30. Did you observe anything unusual in his demeanor or appearance?" Finch's response emerged with the measured precision of a man reading from a prepared script. "Mr. A. Ashworth appeared in his customary state, sir. He was seated at his desk, reviewing his correspondence. He did not speak, as was his habit. I placed the whiskey upon the side table and withdrew. And the correspondence? Did you observe what manner of documents he was reading?" "I could not say, sir. Mr. Ashworth kept his affairs strictly private." Whimsy set down his teacup with the care of one handling an object of considerable fragility. "How remarkably thorough in one's discretion," he observed mildly. "Yet I find it difficult to believe that a man in service for 30 years would not develop a certain awareness of his employer's habits, however scrupulously maintained the boundary between privacy and observation might be. Tell me, had you noticed any change in Mr. Ashworth's demeanor over the past week? Any visitors of unusual character? Any correspondence that appeared to distress him?" A faint tremor passed through Finch's composed features, barely perceptible to the untrained eye. Whimsy, however, possessed an eye trained to the detection of such microscopic disturbances in human composure. "There may have been a letter," Finch admitted reluctantly. "Arrived 3 days ago. Mr. Ashworth opened it and sat for nearly an hour without moving. I thought he might be experiencing some form of medical episode, but he recovered himself and said nothing about it. And this letter, do you recall from whence it came?" "The postmark was illegible, sir. The envelope was of good quality, but there was nothing to distinguish it." Whimsy turned his attention to Rosie, who had been following this exchange with the intensity of a spectator at a theatrical performance. "You discovered your employer's body this morning at 8 o'clock, you said. Had you observed anything unusual about the library yesterday when you were engaged in your routine duties?" Rosie's fingers twisted toge, in a manner disturbingly reminiscent of James Ashworth's earlier nervous exhibition. "The library door was locked, sir. It's always locked in the afternoons, but yesterday when I came to do the dusting around 3 o'clock, Mr. Finch said Mr. Ashworth had given orders not to be disturbed. It stayed locked until this morning." "Interesting," Whimsy mused. "And the window, you mentioned it had been closed since Christmas. Yet I observed fresh scratches upon the lock mechanism, scratches that appear to have been inflicted within the past few days. Can you explain this anomaly?" Both servants exchanged a glance of such profound discomfort that Whimsy felt almost apologetic for having introduced the subject. It was Finch who finally spoke, his voice having acquired a quality of resigned resignation. "The window was opened yesterday evening, sir, around 4 o'clock. A mouse had been detected in the library, and Mr. Ashworth requested that it be aired to discourage the creature's presence. I opened the window myself, stood it ajar for perhaps 10 minutes, then closed and locked it again. I had meant to mention it, but in the circumstances the matter seemed insignificant. How remarkably considerate of you to attempt to suppress information that might bear upon a murder investigation," Whimsy said pleasantly. "Though I confess I am less interested in your motives for deception than I am in the identity of the individual who opened that window subsequently and entered the library through its means. For it is quite clear, you see, that someone did precisely that. The scratches upon the lock are fresh, and the internal dust upon the sill has been disturbed in a manner consistent with the passage of something or someone through the aperture at some point between 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon and 8 o'clock this morning. Inspector Crane, who had been standing by the fireplace with the expression of a man watching his case dissolve into incomprehensibility, stepped forward with sudden urgency. "Are you suggesting, Lord Peter, that an intruder came through that window? A burglar, perhaps?" "I am suggesting nothing of the sort," Whimsy replied, rising to his feet with the deliberation of a man concluding a particularly disappointing luncheon. "I am observing that the window was opened after Mr. Finch had closed it, that the lock has been tampered with, and that someone possessed both the knowledge of the window's location and the motivation to enter this house clandestinely yesterday evening. Whether that someone intended to murder Mr. Ashworth, or whether they discovered him already dead, remains a matter requiring further investigation. What I should now very much like to know is whether any of the household observed unusual sounds or movements during the hours of darkness. Specifically, I should like to know if anyone heard the library door being opened after Mr. Finch's 7 o'clock retirement for the evening. The silence that followed. This question possessed the quality of a held breath, and it was this silence, more than any confession, that told Whimsy precisely where the investigation must next be directed. The library door, when examined in the clear light of mid-morning, revealed itself to be a study in contradiction. Its exterior bore all the marks of heavy oak and solid craftsmanship, suggesting an impenetrability that ought to have rendered unauthorized passage impossible. Yet the lock mechanism, upon closer inspection, displayed the curious characteristic of having been recently oiled, a detail that Whimsy brought to Inspector Crane's attention with the air of a man revealing a particularly clever magic trick to an audience of modest intellectual capacity. "You see, Inspector," Whimsy explained, running his fingers across the lock with the concentration of a violinist examining his instrument. "This lock has been maintained with considerable care, yet it is the care of someone attempting to ensure smooth and silent operation, rather than the care of a man merely preserving his property against the ordinary ravages of time. The hinges, too, exhibit signs of recent lubrication. Someone has taken the considerable trouble of ensuring that the library door might be opened and closed without producing the squeaking and groaning that would ordinarily accompany such a movement." Dr. Hatfield, who had elected to remain behind after the servants' hall interview concluded, regarded this observation with the air of a man witnessing supernatural phenomena without adequate theological preparation. "Are you suggesting," he ventured hesitantly, "that the door was deliberately prepared for silent entry?" "I am suggesting nothing of the sort," Whimsy replied with characteristic archness. "I am merely observing that someone has taken pains to ensure the door's silent operation. Whether that someone is the murderer, or whether they are an entirely separate party engaged in their own clandestine business, remains to be determined. But It does suggest, does it not, that we are dealing with a crime of some premeditation rather than a spontaneous outburst of passion. It was at this precise moment that Whimsy's attention was diverted by an observation so trivial that it possessed all the characteristics of supreme importance. He had noticed, quite by accident while examining the lock, that the carpet beneath the library door exhibited a peculiar depression. Not the sort of depression that would result from the ordinary wear of years, but rather a relatively recent indentation suggesting that something heavy and roughly cylindrical had rested against the door's exterior for an extended period. Upon closer examination, this depression extended approximately 6 inches into the room, and its presence raised the obvious question of what object might have possessed both the weight and the configuration to create such a mark. Whimsy's examination of this detail consumed the better part of 10 minutes, during which he alternated between studying the carpet, peering at the door frame, and consulting his notebook with expressions of increasing fascination. When he finally straightened, it was with the air of a man who had just solved a particularly vexing crossword puzzle clue. "Tell me," he said, addressing himself to Dr. Hatfield with sudden intensity, "did Mr. Ashworth possess any musical instruments? A cello, perhaps, or a bass violin?" Dr. Hatfield blinked at this question with the bewilderment of a man asked to discuss matters entirely beyond his comprehension. A cello? Good heavens, no. Mr. Ashworth was not a musical man. He had no ear for such things, from what I understood. His tastes ran more toward literature and collecting. And yet, Whimsy observed, someone has positioned a long, cylindrical object against the exterior of this door with sufficient force to leave a permanent impression upon the carpet. The object in question possessed considerable weight. I would estimate something in the region of 8 to 12 pounds, and its positioning suggests that it was wedged against the door for a period of no less than several hours. One might propose that such an object was intended to prevent the door from being opened from the inside, which raises the fascinating possibility that Mr. Ashworth was deliberately imprisoned within this room yesterday evening. Inspector Crane's complexion, which had throughout the investigation maintained a steady progression toward shades of crimson and purple, now achieved a hue suggestive of advanced apoplexy. Imprisoned? But the window was locked from the inside. We examined it ourselves this morning. Indeed, Whimsy agreed. The window was locked from the inside this morning. Yet someone opened it yesterday afternoon, climbed through it yesterday evening, and then locked it again before departing. The question becomes, why would a murderer or an intruder of any kind take the considerable trouble of entering through the window, presumably coming around to the front of the house and climbing up the exterior wall in broad daylight or under cover of darkness, only to then enter the house by conventional means and murder the victim within? Whimsy moved toward the narrow drawers that had captured his attention during the initial examination, and with Dr. Hatfield's permission, he withdrew several of the yellowed envelopes within. These he examined with the care of an antiquarian, reading addresses and postmarks, occasionally opening one to glance at its contents before replacing it with evident satisfaction. "These letters," he said conversationally, "span a period of some 40 years. They are organized with admirable precision, chronologically arranged, carefully preserved, marked with annotations in Mr. Ashworth's own hand. A man does not maintain such a collection unless the contents possess considerable emotional significance. What I should very much like to know is whether any of these letters have been recently disturbed or removed, and whether Mr. Ashworth received any correspondence yesterday that might explain his apparent decision to prepare for an evening of seclusion and imprisonment." It was at this juncture that the housemaid, Rosie, appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had been wrestling with her conscience and had finally reached a decision of momentous significance. "Mr. Finch sent me to tell you, sir," she said, addressing herself to Inspector Crane, "but why?" Her eyes fixed upon Whimsy, "that there's a woman come to the front door. She says she's Mr. Ashworth's cousin from Cornwall, and she's arrived quite unexpectedly this morning, before she'd heard the news of his passing. The woman who presented herself in the drawing-room of Ashworth Manor possessed the peculiar quality of appearing, simultaneously, younger and older than one's initial estimate would suggest. She was dressed in traveling clothes of excellent cut, though they bore the evidence of prolonged journey, and her hat, a somewhat theatrical creation in midnight blue, had been positioned with the care of a woman accustomed to making calculated impressions. She introduced herself as Miss Eleanor Ashworth, Cedric's cousin on his mother's side, and her manner of grief was so perfectly calibrated as to suggest either genuine distress or a considerable capacity for theatrical performance. "I received a telegram yesterday morning," she explained, accepting a chair with the grace of someone accustomed to better circumstances than those she currently inhabited, from a solicitor in London informing me that my cousin was gravely ill. I departed Cornwall immediately, drove through the night, and arrived only to discover that I am too late. The circumstances are absolutely dreadful." Whimsy observed this account with evident interest, his expression suggesting that he found something about Miss Eleanor's story to be either amusing or deeply suspicious. "A telegram from a solicitor," he repeated thoughtfully. "How very expeditious of the gentleman to contact you with such urgency. I do not believe I observed any telegram among Mr. Ashworth's correspondence, and yet one would imagine such a communication to be of considerable importance. Do you perhaps have the document upon your person?" Miss Eleanor's composed expression underwent a subtle alteration, the sort of change that might pass unnoticed by an observer less attuned to the micro-expressions of dissimulation. She withdrew a folded telegram from her handbag with the deliberation of a woman retrieving an object she has handled many times in recent hours, and Whimsy examined it with the concentration of a man reading Sanskrit. The telegram was dated the previous morning, sent from London, and signed by J. Pemberton, solicitor. Its contents were sufficiently vague to be virtually meaningless. "Mr. Cedric Ashworth, gravely ill. Stop. Advise immediate journey. Stop. Matter of considerable importance. Stop." And its origin raised the immediate question of how a solicitor named Pemberton had acquired the information regarding Mr. Ashworth's supposed illness before anyone else in the household appeared to possess such knowledge. "Fascinating," Whimsy murmured, returning the document to Miss Eleanor. "And did you not find it curious that your cousin's solicitor would send such a communication without specifying the nature of the illness, the location of Mr. Ashworth's residence, or indeed any of the practical details one would ordinarily expect to accompany such an urgent summons?" Miss Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly upon the telegram. "I assumed the matter was sufficiently serious to require haste rather than elaboration. I have been living abroad for several years, and the solicitor presumably sought merely to ensure my immediate response. And yet," Whimsy continued with the air of a man pursuing an interesting line of philosophical inquiry, "you arrived at Ashworth Manor at precisely what hour this morning?" "I drove through the night," she replied. "I arrived at approximately 7 o'clock, perhaps a few minutes before or after. I came directly to the front door and rang the bell." Inspector Crane, who had been following this exchange with the bewilderment of a man watching a chess TCH in which the rules were being invented by one of the players, intervened with heavy-handed pragmatism. "Miss Ashworth's account can hardly be suspicious. She drove from Cornwall, received word of her cousin's illness, and made haste to attend him. There is nothing incriminating in that." "Nothing incriminating whatsoever," Whimsy agreed cordially. "And yet, I wonder if Miss Eleanor might explain how she came to possess such detailed knowledge of her cousin's residence, as to drive directly to Ashworth Manor without requiring directions, despite having been abroad for several years, and, as I perceive from the condition of her traveling clothes, having undertaken a journey of considerable duration." Miss Eleanor's composure underwent another subtle fracture. She set down her handbag with a gesture that suggested increasing agitation. "My cousin's address was provided in the telegram." "Indeed," Whimsy replied smoothly. "And yet when I examined the document, I observed that the telegram contains no address whatsoever, merely a statement regarding Mr. Ashworth's supposed illness and an implicit request for your immediate presence. One might ask how you navigated to this particular manor house, situated in the Cotswolds, without such information." The silence that followed this observation was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that seemed to grow progressively louder as no one offered an alternative explanation. Finally, Miss Eleanor's shoulders underwent a subtle descent, and her expression transformed, into something altogether more candid. "I lied," she said quietly. "I did not drive from Cornwall yesterday. I have been in London for a month, staying with friends. The telegram was not from a solicitor. It was from my cousin himself. He wrote to me a week ago, asking me to come to Ashworth Manor, but he instructed me not to tell Ennio of my arrival. He said the matter was of supreme personal importance, and that he required my assistance in a delicate matter." Whimsy leaned forward with renewed interest. "And what was the nature of this delicate matter that required your clandestine presence at his residence?" Miss Eleanor's eyes shifted toward the window, toward the portrait of an elderly gentleman that hung above the fireplace, and finally toward her own hands. "He wished to alter his will," she said slowly. "He had recently received information that had caused him to reconsider his previous arrangements. He mentioned something about a deception of long standing, a matter that involved his family, and he was determined that the truth should be known after his death, even if revealing it would cause considerable scandal and distress." Whimsy sat back in his chair with an expression of satisfaction. "And did he explain the nature of this deception?" Miss Eleanor shook her head. "He said only that it involved a woman to whom he had been devoted many years ago, and that certain documents had recently come into his possession that had illuminated events he had misunderstood for decades. He seemed almost broken by the revelation, yet also, strangely, relieved." Whimsy's gaze shifted toward the narrow drawers, and his expression suggested that he had just achieved a significant understanding of matters hitherto obscure. "Tell me, Miss Eleanor," he said softly, "did your cousin mention the name of this woman, or describe in any detail the nature of the deception?" Miss Eleanor's response emerged with the reluctance of a woman surrendering information she had clearly intended to protect, and her words possessed the quality of long-held confidences finally released into the world. "He mentioned a woman named Catherine," she said quietly. "Catherine Marchant. He said she had been his intended bride some 40 years ago, before circumstances had intervened to separate them. He believed at the time that she had deliberately rejected him, that she had chosen a wealthier suitor and abandoned their engagement without explanation. But the documents he had recently obtained suggested a different narrative entirely, that she had been forced to relinquish him, that her family had intercepted their correspondence, and that she had spent her life believing he had abandoned her." Whimsy rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man suddenly possessed of a clear direction, and he moved directly toward the narrow drawers with an expression of grim certainty. Dr. Hatfield, who had maintained the discretion of a peripheral observer throughout the preceding exchanges, watched as Whimsy withdrew several envelopes from the collection and examined the names inscribed upon them. When he had selected approximately 30 letters, each bearing the same handwriting and spanning a period from 1882 to 1884, he turned to Miss Eleanor with a question of deceptive casualness. "These letters," he said, indicating the correspondence he had removed, "are they the documents to which your cousin referred?" "The correspondence between himself and Miss Catherine Marchant?" Miss Eleanor's eyes widened with evident surprise. "How could you possibly know?" "Because," Whimsy replied, settling himself once more into his chair with the deliberation of a man about to deliver a lengthy and important explanation, "they are arranged in precisely the manner one would expect of a man who had preserved evidence of profound emotional significance with the care of an archivist preserving historical documents. The letters span a 2-year period. They are organized chronologically, and they are annotated with dates and, if I am not mistaken, emotional commentary that suggests their author had been reviewing them with increasing distress. But more importantly, they represent precisely the sort of correspondence that a man of Mr. Ashworth's evident temperament would retain as proof of a romance that had shaped the entire course of his subsequent life. Inspector Crane, whose capacity for following complex lines of reasoning appeared to have reached its absolute limit, settled himself into a chair with the resignation of a man watching events unfold according to laws he did not comprehend. "But what does this have to do with his murder?" he asked with a degree of exasperation. "Miss Eleanor's story about a deception 40 years old hardly explains how her cousin came to be dead in his library yesterday evening." "On the contrary," Whimsy replied with undisguised satisfaction, It explains a great deal if one approaches the problem from the correct angle. You see, Inspector, the crucial question is not who possessed a motive to murder Mr. Ashworth, but rather who possessed knowledge that Mr. Ashworth had recently acquired information that would necessitate significant alterations to his will. Someone in this household, or someone with access to this household, was aware that Mr. Ashworth's revised will would disinherit the obvious beneficiary in favor of someone else entirely. He turned his attention to Miss Eleanor with renewed intensity. "Tell me, when you arrived at Ashworth Manor, did you encounter your cousin in person? Did he explain precisely what alterations he intended to make to his will?" "No," Miss Eleanor replied. "I was to arrive yesterday afternoon. I sent word ahead by telephone, and my cousin arranged for the household to deny knowledge of my presence. I was to enter through the garden entrance and avoid the servants entirely. But I did not arrive until nearly midnight, for my motor car developed mechanical difficulties on the road, and by the time I reached the manor, the house was in darkness." Whimsy's attention sharpened with almost predatory intensity. "You arrived at midnight. And your cousin was... what precisely?" "The library door was locked," Miss Eleanor continued, her voice assuming the quality of a woman recounting a nightmare. "I knocked, but there was no response. I attempted the door several times, and then, fearing that something had gone amiss, I sought out Mr. Finch. He informed me that my cousin had retired for the evening and could not be disturbed, and he insisted that I leave the premises immediately. There was something in his manner that frightened me, Lord Peter, something that suggested he knew of my arrival and disapproved of it intensely." Dr. Hatfield made a small sound of protest. "Finch would never harm Mr. Ashworth. The man has been in service for 30 years. He worshipped the ground upon which—" "Precisely," Whimsy interrupted with glacial precision. "Mr. Finch has been in service for 30 years, 30 years during which he would have observed his employer's solitary existence, his withdrawal from society, his apparent contentment with isolation. 30 years during which a devoted servant might have developed his own opinions regarding the distribution of his employer's estate, and more pertinently, 30 years during which he would have had ample opportunity to observe Mr. Ashworth's habits, his routines, and the precise manner in which the household functioned." Whimsy moved toward the fireplace, where the silver salver still gleamed with aggressive polish. He touched it lightly, observing the way the light reflected from its surface, and then turned back to address the assembled company with the air of a man who had finally resolved the essential contradictions of the case. "The question that has troubled me throughout this investigation," he said slowly, "is how Mr. Ashworth came to die without any apparent indication of struggle or distress. The locked window, the silent door, the careful arrangement of the corpse, all suggest a death orchestrated with considerable forethought and precision. But the most significant detail is one that Inspector Crane has overlooked entirely. The glass from which Mr. Ashworth drank his whiskey was discovered empty upon the side table this morning, yet there was no trace of poison, no indication of contamination, nothing whatsoever to suggest that the beverage had been altered in any manner designed to cause death. The observation hung in the library like a suspended sentence awaiting its conclusion, and it was Dr. Hatfield who first recognized the implication of Whimsy's statement. The physician's face underwent a transformation remarkable in its rapidity, progressing from confusion to comprehension to something approaching horror. "You are suggesting," he said carefully, "that the whiskey itself was not poisoned, but rather that something was introduced into the glass itself, something that would dissolve or dissipate over time." "Not merely something," Whimsy corrected with the air of a man indulging a particularly slow student. "Rather, a substance deliberately chosen for its capacity to remain undetected in chemical analysis, yet capable of producing symptoms consistent with a particularly peaceful and undramatic form of death. Tell me, Doctor, when you examined the body this morning, did you observe anything that struck you as unusual beyond the general fact of Mr. Ashworth's demise?" Dr. Hatfield's fingers trembled slightly as he recalled the details of his examination. The pupils were neither dilated nor constricted. The lips bore a faint bluish discoloration, but nothing dramatic. The body was still warm to the touch, suggesting death had occurred within the previous few hours. "I confess I found nothing definitively diagnostic." "Which is to say," Whimsy observed, that you found nothing that would have prevented you from concluding death resulted from natural causes, cardiac failure perhaps, or a cerebral incident. Yet the arrangement of the body, the sealed room, the locked window, all suggest a design far more deliberate than nature's random cruelty. Inspector Crane, I should like to know whether the whiskey glass was subjected to chemical analysis. Inspector Crane consulted his notebook with the air of a man reading from a document written in an incomprehensible cipher. We found nothing of significance, he admitted. Whiskey residue, the ordinary contents one would expect, nothing poisonous. And yet, Whimsy continued, you did not test for the presence of certain cardiac substances, digitalis perhaps, or one of the more exotic alkaloids derived from plants that Mr. Ashworth himself may have cultivated in his garden. I observed during my preliminary survey of the grounds that there are several specimens of considerable botanical interest growing in the conservatory, foxglove, nightshade, oleander. A man of Mr. Ashworth's scholarly inclinations might well have maintained such a collection out of intellectual curiosity. The implications of this observation began to coalesce in the minds of his auditors, and it was Miss Eleanor who articulated the horrifying conclusion first. You are suggesting that my cousin deliberately consumed a poison? That he committed suicide? I am suggesting nothing of the sort, Whimsy replied with characteristic asperity. Suicide is a hypothesis that fails to account for several critical elements of this case. If Mr. Ashworth had intended to end his life, he would have required neither the sealed room, nor the locked window, nor the mysterious object that was wedged against the library door. A man intent upon self-destruction does not orchestrate an elaborate charade designed to simulate locked-room murder. No, Miss Eleanor, your cousin did not take his own life, though I confess the murderer has engineered a scenario of considerable complexity designed to suggest precisely such a conclusion. Whimsy moved toward the narrow drawers once more, and this time he withdrew not letters, but a small leather journal bound in morocco and bearing the initials CA embossed upon its cover. He opened it to a page marked with a ribbon, and the passage he read aloud possessed the quality of confession transcribed by the deceased's own hand. I have discovered the truth at last, and the knowledge of it has destroyed the peace I have cultivated through decades of deliberate ignorance. Catherine did not abandon me. Her family intercepted our correspondence, threatened her with disinheritance, forced her into a marriage of convenience with a man of considerable fortune but limited character. She spent 40 years believing I had rejected her, believing our love had been insufficient to withstand the vicissitudes of circumstance, and I spent 40 years believing she had chosen wealth and comfort over devotion. Now, at the twilight of my existence, I have learned that we were both victims of a conspiracy of cruelty orchestrated by people long dead. Catherine passed away 5 years ago, still believing me faithless. I cannot restore her life, but I can ensure that my estate, the considerable fortune that I accumulated in the decades following our separation, passes to her descendants rather than to the nephew who bears my name and shares nothing of my nature. Whimsy closed the journal with deliberate care, and when he looked up, his expression suggested he had just reached the threshold of an understanding both terrible and inevitable. The question that now confronts us, he said quietly, is whether Mr. Ashworth reached this decision independently or whether someone in this household influenced that decision with knowledge of the alterations he intended to make to his will, and more importantly, whether that someone determined that the revision of his will represented a threat sufficiently grave to warrant his removal before such alterations could be executed. He turned directly toward Dr. Hatfield. You have been Mr. Ashworth's physician for how many years? Approximately 20, Dr. Hatfield replied, his voice barely above a whisper. You would therefore have had access to the house at irregular intervals, access that would have attracted no suspicion whatsoever. You would have known the household routines, the habits of the servants, the precise manner in which Mr. Ashworth spent his evenings, and you would have known, moreover, that Mr. Ashworth had recently begun to question the arrangements of his life, that he had summoned his cousin for purposes of altering his will, and that he intended to execute this revision before his death, a revision that would have rendered you, as the named executor of his previous will, entirely without influence over the distribution of his considerable estate. Dr. Hatfield's face underwent a transformation from pale apprehension to something approaching resignation. "I did not poison him," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "But I knew who did, and I remained silent because the person responsible acted out of a desperation I could not condemn entirely." Inspector Crane's hand moved instinctively toward the constable stationed at the library door, yet Whimsy raised a single finger in a gesture of such quiet authority that the motion was arrested before it achieved completion. "Before you proceed with the customary pageantry of arrest and accusation," Whimsy said, "I believe Dr. Hatfield's unfinished sentence possesses considerably more significance than the interruption would permit. The good doctor has just informed us that he did not administer the poison, yet he claims knowledge of the party responsible and admits to a conspiracy of silence motivated by empathy rather than malice. This suggests, does it not, that the murderer is someone whose desperation he found comprehensible, someone whose circumstances were sufficiently dire as to justify, in his mind at least, the termination of a life?" Dr. Hatfield's composure, which had maintained a precarious equilibrium throughout the preceding exchanges, underwent a sudden and catastrophic collapse. His shoulders sagged, and when he finally spoke, his voice emerged with the quality of a confession long postponed, and now, at last, released into the light. "It was Finch," he said quietly, "but not from mercenary motives, and not from any desire to inherit Mr. Ashworth's wealth. Finch has a daughter. You see, a girl of perhaps 22 years, illegitimate, born to a woman with whom Finch had a liaison some 23 years ago. The woman died in childbirth, and Finch has raised the girl alone, supported entirely by his wages as butler. She is a talented musician, brilliant really, and Finch had arranged for her to study at the conservatory in London on the condition that he could guarantee her financial security for the duration of her training." Whimsy nodded slowly, as though this information confirmed some private theory, and Mr. Ashworth, in his newly discovered determination to revise his will in favor of Catherine Marchant's descendants, would have eliminated the supplementary provisions that he had apparently made for the support of Finch's daughter. "Not merely eliminated them," Dr. Hatfield replied, his voice hollow with the weight of guilty knowledge. "He intended to dismiss Finch entirely. The revised will contained a clause stating that any servant who had abused the trust of the household through concealment of personal circumstances would be terminated without reference or provision. Finch would have been turned out at his age, with nothing but a pittance of pension, and his daughter's education would have been abandoned." The portrait of Mr. Cedric Ashworth seemed to regard the assembled company with renewed significance, as though his painted countenance had achieved sudden comprehension of the tragedy that had unfolded beneath his roof. Whimsy moved toward the window, that supposedly inviolate barrier which had proven to be the means of the murderer's entry, and his gaze traced the path that Finch must have followed in his desperate nocturnal expedition. "Tell me the precise sequence of events," Whimsy commanded, his tone suggesting that Dr. Hatfield possessed no option but complete and truthful confession. "How did Finch come to Posse? The poison. How did he contrive to introduce it into his employer's whiskey? And most importantly, how did he manage to lock the window from the outside after having entered through it?" Dr. Hatfield drew a breath that seemed to expand within his chest with the weight of years of concealed knowledge. "Finch cultivated the foxglove himself," he said slowly. "He had learned something of herbalism from a book, I do not know which one, and he had been experimenting with the preparation of various plant extracts. The digitalis was concentrated, dissolved carefully, and introduced into the whiskey glass while it sat upon the library table, awaiting Mr. Ashworth's arrival at 6 o'clock. Finch had oiled the hinges and lock of the library door, and he had used a length of lead pipe, taken from the garden shed, to wedge it closed from the outside, creating the impression that Mr. Ashworth had deliberately barricaded himself within the room. "And the window?" Whimsy pressed. "How did Finch enter and depart through an aperture that was locked from within?" "The window lock," Dr. Hatfield explained, "was not as secure as it appeared. Finch had replaced the original mechanism 3 years ago during repairs to the frame. He had retained access to the key, a duplicate, fashioned without Mr. Ashworth's knowledge. He opened the window from the outside yesterday afternoon, when he came to examine it for the supposed mouse. He then closed it, but the lock remained unfastened. When he returned last evening after depositing the poisoned whiskey, he entered through the window, locked it properly from within, and departed through the library door after removing the pipe wedge from the exterior. Inspector Crane made a sound of profound confusion. But if he locked the window from within, how did he exit the room without leaving it unlocked? He did not exit through the window, Whimsy Repley. Ed, his understanding now complete. He exited through the library door, which he then locked from the outside using a key, one of Mr. Ashworth's spare keys, which he possessed as butler. The window was left locked because Finch knew that an investigation would focus upon it, and a locked window from within would suggest that Mr. Ashworth had deliberately imprisoned himself, that he had orchestrated his own death to prevent the revision of his will. It would have appeared as suicide motivated by remorse and desperation. Miss Eleanor rose from her chair with sudden urgency. But where is Finch now? Surely he has not remained at the manor. Inspector Crane rushed toward the door, dispatching constables with frantic gestures, yet Whimsy remained perfectly still, his expression suggesting that he had anticipated precisely this question and had already calculated its answer. Finch departed the manor at approximately 11 o'clock last evening, he said quietly. When Miss Eleanor arrived and attempted to contact her cousin, Finch recognized that the carefully constructed timeline was beginning to unravel. He was aware that Mr. Ashworth's revised will, if it came to light, would implicate him through the very clause designed to punish his concealment, and he was intelligent enough to recognize that flight offered his only escape from consequences he'd attempted to forestall through murder. The butler's absence from the household suddenly achieved terrible significance, and Inspector Crane's face transformed into an expression of dawning comprehension, followed immediately by acute embarrassment at having overlooked so obvious a detail. The search for Finch proved to be a matter of considerably less urgency than Inspector Crane's precipitate dispatch of constables might have suggested, for it emerged within the hour that the butler had, in fact, elected to remain at Worth Manor rather than attempt flight. He was discovered in the servants' quarters, seated in his small room with a cup of tea grown cold upon the table beside him, a leather suitcase packed with meticulous care resting against the wall, and a letter of confession composed in his neat, precise handwriting lying upon the bed. Inspector Crane entered this tableau with the triumphant air of a man who believed he had orchestrated a capture of considerable tactical brilliance, only to discover that his quarry had rendered such capture superfluous through voluntary surrender. Finch himself regarded the constables with an expression of profound weariness, as though the act of maintaining his composure through the morning's interrogations had exhausted the last reserves of his considerable dignity. "I did not run," he said quietly, addressing himself to no one in particular, because there seemed little point in doing so. The facts would emerge. Lord Peter would ensure that they emerged, and my daughter would learn eventually that her security had been purchased through the death of a man who had shown her father nothing but kindness for 3 decades. I preferred instead to remain and face the consequences of my actions, though I confess the realization of what I have done has grown progressively more unbearable as the hours have passed. Whimsy examined the confession with the care of a man reading a final testament, and his expression underwent subtle alterations as he progressed through Finch's account of his motivations and methodology. When he had finished, he looked up with an expression that combined professional appreciation with something approaching personal regret. "You are an intelligent man," Whimsy observed, "which is precisely what makes your actions so profoundly tragic. You recognize that Mr. Ashworth's revised will represented not merely a financial stir for your daughter, but a personal betrayal of decades of devoted service. You understood that the old gentleman's newfound concern for the descendants of a woman long dead was motivated by guilty conscience rather than genuine affection, and you perceived that the alternative to murder was the destruction of everything you had worked to construct." Finch's composure underwent a subtle fracture at this characterization of his motives, and for a moment it appeared he might protest the accuracy of Whimsy's assessment. Yet when he finally spoke, his words suggested a man who had long ago reconciled himself to the impossibility of justifying the unjustifiable. "I loved that man," Finch said simply. "Mr. Ashworth took me into his household when I was a youth of 18 years, and he provided me with position, security, and above all, dignity. He never treated me as a mere servant, though he maintained perfect propriety in all his dealings with me. When my daughter was born, when I confessed to him that I had fathered a child out of wedlock, he did not dismiss me as society would have demanded. Instead, he quietly arranged for her education, provided funds for her support, and never once made me feel ashamed of the circumstances of her birth." The old butler's fingers trembled slightly as he recounted this history, and his voice took on the quality of a man speaking about something irrevocably lost. But when he discovered that Catherine Marchant had borne a daughter he had never known existed, everything changed. His entire understanding of his life underwent a transformation. He began to see his accumulated wealth not as the fruit of his own labor and sacrifice, but as the spoils of a life that should have been lived entirely differently. He wished to rectify history, to undo decades of choices, and in doing so, he was prepared to destroy the present entirely, in service to a past that could never be recovered. Whimsy moved toward the window of the small servants' room, a narrow aperture that afforded a view of the manor grounds stretching toward the distant hills. His expression suggested that he was considering something that extended far beyond the immediate facts of the case. "And the poison," he said, not turning from the window, "was administered not as an act of sudden passion, but as a calculated response to Mr. Ashworth's explicit statement regarding the revision of his will." "He showed me the draft of the new will himself," Finch replied, with a voice that had achieved a kind of hollow acceptance. "He was attempting to ease my mind, I think, to suggest that even though he was altering his arrangements in favor of Miss Catherine's descendants, he would ensure that I was not left destitute. But when I read the clause regarding servants who had abused the trust of the household through concealment of personal circumstances, I understood that he had already decided to dismiss me. That clause was written directly into the document, as though it had been designed specifically for my circumstances." Inspector Crane made a sound of protest. "But surely you could have reasoned with him, explained your situation? A man of Mr. Ashworth's apparent refinement would surely have understood your desperation." "A man of Mr. Ashworth's refinement," Finch replied with a bitterness that seemed entirely disproportionate to his usual demeanor, "had just spent an hour explaining to me why a woman he had loved 40 years ago deserved compensation for a life lived in ignorance of his affection. He had become, in the space of a single afternoon, a man consumed by guilt and a desperate need to rectify history. There was no reasoning with him because he had already reasoned himself into a position from which he could not retreat without betraying the moral clarity he had suddenly achieved." Whimsy turned from the window, and his expression suggested that he had reached a conclusion of considerable philosophical weight. "You administered the poison gradually, I presume, over the course of several days, allowing small quantities of the digitalis extract to accumulate in his system, so that when the final concentrated dose was introduced yesterday evening, the shock to his cardiac system would appear as a natural failure, rather than acute poisoning." Finch nodded slowly, and the gesture seemed to drain the last vestiges of his resistance. 4 days, he confirmed quietly, small amounts in his coffee each morning, in his evening whiskey, in the soup prepared for his dinner. By the time I introduced the concentrated dose yesterday, his heart was already weakened sufficiently that the final shock produced death within minutes. He felt no pain, I think. He simply ceased to exist, as quietly and gently as one might blow out a candle at the end of the day. The confession, once begun, emerged with the inevitability of a dam finally breached, and Finch proceeded to detail with meticulous precision the elaborate preparations that had preceded Mr. Ashworth's death. He described how he had cultivated the foxglove in a corner of the conservatory under the guise of maintaining the botanical collection, how he had spent 3 evenings carefully extracting and concentrating the digitalis through a process learned from an old herbalist's manual discovered in the manor's library, how he had tested the poison's efficacy upon an elderly cat that had wandered into the kitchens, a detail that caused Dr. Hatfield to wince with evident revulsion. The methodology was chilling in its premeditation, Finch had even anticipated the possibility of chemical analysis and had deliberately chosen digitalis over more exotic compounds. B. Because he understood that the poison would be confused with Mr. Ashworth's supposed cardiac condition, that Dr. Hatfield, examining the body without the knowledge of poisoning, would likely attribute death to natural causes and sign the death certificate without requiring further investigation. I had calculated, Finch explained with the tone of a man reciting mathematics rather than murder, that if the initial examination suggested natural death, an inquest would be considered unnecessary. The revised will would then come to light, and though it would disinherit my daughter, at least the household would understand that I had remained faithful to my duties until the very end. My dismissal would appear to be a consequence of the new arrangements rather than a betrayal discovered during an investigation into foul play. Yet as Finch continued his confession, a detail emerged that caused Whimsy's expression to shift from grim comprehension to something approaching profound unease. The butler mentioned, almost parenthetically, that he had not acted entirely alone in his preparations. Dr. Hatfield had provided advice regarding the botanical properties of various toxins, had suggested which compounds might prove most difficult to detect in post-mortem examination, and had even furnished Finch with a small bottle containing a concentrated extract for purposes of insurance, as the doctor had phrased it. Dr. Hatfield knew? Inspector Crane's voice rose to a pitch suggesting his capacity for processing criminal complexity had finally achieved its absolute limit. You are telling me that this respected physician deliberately assisted in the preparation of a murder? Not deliberately, Dr. Hatfield interjected from where he stood near the doorway, his voice carrying a quality of desperation that suggested he had been anticipating this revelation with dread. I did not know, the time I provided the information, that Finch intended to commit murder. He approached me as a man seeking to understand the properties of certain plants, claiming an interest in botanical toxicology for purposes of general knowledge. It was only after Mr. Ashworth's death was discovered that I understood the significance of his questions, that I realized what he had done. Yet the explanation, when examined with any degree of rigor, possessed the characteristics of profound sophistry. Dr. Hatfield had known of Mr. Ashworth's intention to revise his will, had recognized the catastrophic implications for Finch's daughter, and had possessed sufficient medical knowledge to understand precisely what Finch was asking when he inquired about substances that would prove difficult to detect and would mimic natural cardiac failure. The distinction between deliberate assistance and willful blindness suddenly appeared remarkably negligible. Whimsy's expression hardened into something approximating cold fury, a transformation so complete that even Inspector Crane seemed to recognize the magnitude of his own earlier errors in judgment. You have just admitted, Whimsy said quietly, addressing himself to Dr. Hatfield, to being an accessory to murder, not through accident, not through misguided compassion, but through a calculated decision to provide assistance to a man you knew to be desperate and capable of violence. Your subsequent silence constitutes not merely a failure to report a crime, but an active conspiracy to conceal evidence and obstruct justice. I wonder whether your Medical Ethics Committee would find your conduct sufficiently egregious to warrant revocation of your license. Dr. Hatfield's complexion underwent a transformation from pale apprehension to a sickly grey-green that suggested imminent physical illness. He steadied himself against the doorframe and, "Where?" he finally spoke. His voice emerged with the broken quality of a man whose professional reputation had just disintegrated before his eyes. I convinced myself, he began, his words stumbling over one another in a rush toward confession, that I was acting in the service of a higher morality. Finch's daughter is a remarkable young woman, truly gifted in ways that suggest she might achieve genuine excellence in her chosen field. The notion that such potential might be extinguished because an elderly man had decided to rectify ancient history seemed to me profoundly unjust. When Finch approached me with his questions, I told myself that I was merely engaging in academic discussion, that he would never actually proceed to such an extreme course of action. Yet even as the doctor attempted this justification, his own words betrayed him. The information he had provided was too specific, too calibrated to Finch's evident desperation to be credibly characterized as innocent academic discourse, and his decision to remain silent after Mr. Ashworth's death, to allow an investigation to proceed without revealing his knowledge of events, constituted a conscious choice to prioritize his own security over the demands of justice. Wimsey moved toward a small desk positioned near the window of Finch's quarters, and upon it he observed a stack of correspondence, letters written in a young woman's hand, discussing musical compositions, performance anxieties, the extraordinary privilege of receiving an education that might never have been possible without patronage. These letters, clearly treasured and frequently reread, painted a portrait of a daughter, cherishing her father's sacrifice and devotion. Wimsey gathered them carefully and turned to address both men with an expression that combined judicial severity with something approaching compassion. "You have constructed between you a tragedy of considerable proportion," he said quietly. "Two men, both acting from motives that possess a certain terrible logic, have conspired to murder an elderly gentleman whose only crime was the discovery of a love betrayed and a desire to rectify that betrayal. And in doing so, you have ensured that the very daughter you sought to protect will learn that her education, her opportunity, her entire future has been constructed upon the foundation of her father's crime and your complicity in concealing it. I wonder whether she will find your actions as noble as you have convinced yourselves they are." The constables took both men into custody with the mechanical efficiency of individuals performing duties they had executed countless times before, yet neither Finch nor Dr. Hatfield offered resistance. They proceeded toward the waiting motor car with the demeanor of men who had already mentally traversed the trajectory of their remaining lives and found it to be a landscape of diminishing horizons. Inspector Crane, having finally achieved some semblance of comprehension regarding the case's essential details, departed in their wake with the evident satisfaction of a man who had solved a crime of considerable complexity, a satisfaction that Wimsey did nothing to disturb by correcting his misapprehension. Miss Eleanor Ashworth remained in the library long after the others had gone, her attention fixed upon the narrow drawers and the correspondence they contained, and it was she who eventually posed the question that had been forming throughout the investigation's denouement. "What will become of Finch's daughter?" she asked quietly. "She will inherit nothing now, I presume, and when she discovers the true circumstances of her father's situation, she will lose far more than mere financial security." Wimsey regarded her with an expression that suggested he had been anticipating this inquiry with a mixture of approval and profound melancholy. "That," he said slowly, "is a matter that requires some consideration." Mr. Ashworth's revised will, which he completed but never formally executed, contains provisions leaving a substantial portion of his estate to Catherine Marchand's descendants. However, that will was never witnessed properly, never signed in the presence of appropriate legal authorities, and thus remains merely a draft document without legal force. The estate will pass, therefore, according to the original will, which names you as beneficiary and provides specific bequests for certain household staff and charitable institutions. Miss Eleanor's eyes widened with comprehension of Wimsey's implication. "You are suggesting that I might honor my cousin's revised intentions, even though the document lacks legal validity?" "I am suggesting nothing of the sort," Wimsey replied with characteristic evasion. "I am merely observing that Mr. Ashworth's true wishes, however imperfectly expressed in his final days, are now a matter of historical record. What you choose to do with that knowledge is, of course, a matter of personal conscience, though I should note that there are few acts more consonant with genuine morality than attempting to rectify the mistakes of the dead, particularly when such rectification requires personal sacrifice." Over the following weeks, Wimsey maintained a professional distance from the case as it proceeded through the mechanisms of criminal justice. Finch was charged with murder most foul, though the prosecution's case was complicated by the sympathetic nature of his motives and the quality of Dr. Hatfield's unwitting complicity. The trial, when it eventually occurred, became something of a sensation in the legal journals, with considerable debate regarding the moral culpability of individuals acting from desperatio, rather than malice. Public opinion, in that peculiar fashion characteristic of British society, found itself divided between those who regarded Finch as a murderer, deserving of the full severity of the law, and those who perceived him as a tragic figure crushed by circumstances beyond his control. Dr. Hatfield's case proved simpler in its culpability, if more complex in its implications. He was convicted of being an accessory after the fact, and suspended from medical practice for a period of 5 years, a punishment that effectively destroyed his career at an age when rebuilding would prove impossible. The sentence, though lenient by the standards of criminal law, constituted a social death far more profound than imprisonment might have achieved. As for Miss Eleanor Ashworth, she proved to be a woman of genuine principle. The revised will's provisions were honored in their essential spirit, if not their technical form. Catherine Marchant's descendants received substantial bequests, enough to secure their financial futures without lavish excess, and a considerable portion of the estate was directed toward the establishment of a musical scholarship in Catherine's name, a gesture that ensured Finch's daughter would be able to complete her conservatory education without the financial support that had been predicated upon her father's continued employment. The scholarship, though not bearing her father's name, served as a subtle recognition of the sacrifice he had attempted to make. Whimsy received a letter from the young woman some months after the trial concluded. She had learned the truth of her father's actions, and her response to that knowledge was characterized by a complexity that would have done credit to a tragic heroine in a Greek drama. She did not forgive him, precisely, but neither did she condemn him entirely. Instead, she channeled her energies into her musica. Studies with a ferocity that suggested she was attempting to justify, through excellence in her art, the catastrophic choices he had made. Whimsy read this letter with an expression of profound sadness, recognizing in it the terrible wisdom that comes from understanding that even the most sympathetic crimes generate consequences that ripple outward across decades. He filed the letter in the drawer alongside his notes regarding the case, and he did not speak of Ashworth Manor again, a discretion that was entirely characteristic of his approach to matters, that had forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that morality is far more fragile and complicated than the written law suggests. On a grey afternoon in May, as Whimsy was preparing to depart London for a brief respite in the country, he received a visitor, Inspector Crane, who had come to discuss certain technical matters relating to the case and to express his gratification that Lord Peter's involvement had resulted in a conviction. As the inspector was departing, he paused at the doorway and offered a final observation. "I confess I remain somewhat confused by certain aspects of the investigation, Lord Peter, particularly regarding your early certainty that the case involved something rather more sinister than a simple murder of passion." Whimsy regarded him with the faint smile of a man who had long ago made peace with the limitations of others' comprehension. "My dear Inspector, the case presented itself as a locked-room mystery of the most theatrical variety, complete with a desperate air, a sealed chamber, and a convenient corpus positioned with almost choreographic precision. The only element missing was a supernatural explanation, and I confess I spent considerable time waiting for Mr. Ashworth's ghost to materialize and accuse his murderer. Instead, what we discovered was something far more profound. A disturbing, a murder perpetrated not by a villain of recognizable malevolence, but by a man of genuine devotion acting from desperation, assisted by another man of respectable standing who convinced himself that morality supersedes legality. The mystery, you see, was never who had poisoned Mr. Ashworth, but rather why a good man should feel compelled to commit murder, and how a respectable physician should become willing to compromise his principles in service to what he perceived as justice. Those are mysteries far more unsettling than any locked-room puzzle, and they are mysteries that our legal system is profoundly ill-equipped to answer.